Hello, everyone, and happy Monday to you all, and welcome to episode 2 of season 3 of the Historians Lounge. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe, and joining me today is a guest who needs no introduction. Now, if you remember her, she made her official debut last year in her very own historian's interview. And if you also remember that episode, you also remember me being sick as a dog, which it was good that I was able to have her, but for me, myself, was not the best. So we have now back a second appearance, and as I said, this person needs no introduction. She is the owner and founder of the Historians magazine. She and her team have been busy at work pumping out new material. Their first issue for 2025 is coming out, which I'll provide the link down below. She is busy in all new projects for the Little Historians, as well as the Instagram, as well as Little Historians TV. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to a returning guest, Rosie Maggs. Rosie, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's going to be fun to talk about some other history things.
Awesome. So, Rosie, before we dive into today's topic, would you like to share with our viewers and listeners what you have been up to since last time you were here on the show?
Yeah, so just doing lots more filming and producing more magazines and yeah, just a lot of magazine stuff, but it's been good. It's been good fun doing lots of different topics, filming in lots of different locations. So I think since I was last on, I went to Bath to film stuff about Jane Austen and Bath. Um, so yeah, interesting. Lots of different things, and most of it will be coming out in the next like 2 or 3 months.
Awesome. And also, it would be wrong for me not to mention, of course, your achievement, which is, if I'm not mistaken, History Hits Historians 30 Under 30, correct?
Yeah, so I kind of forgot about that. So yeah, that did happen.
Awesome. Well, can you tell us a little bit about that and, just how that came about?
Yeah, so it was BBC History magazine, and then they were doing it for like UK historians. So I just submitted a video talking about what I'm up to, and then I won. But yeah, there's some great other historians on the list as well that um yeah, all doing lots of different things. So obviously I'm doing the magazine, some people are doing like collections and working in different like galleries and stuff like that. So it's really interesting.
Awesome. Well, congratulations to you and everyone else who were a part of that. That is a huge achievement. I just love when I see, historians getting a lot of recognition for their hard work and dedication. And you and your team have been like busy at work. I mean, the Historians magazine and the Little Historians, you guys have been pumping out content like it's no tomorrow. I mean, you're making your own little TV episodes, you're making content on YouTube. It's just crazy. And you're bringing to the forefront new topics that none of us have ever heard of, which I absolutely love. And speaking of unknown historical topics, in this episode, Rosie is going to be telling me about a period in history, or rather, a group of people in history that I have no idea about. So, Rosie, would you like to share with our viewers and listeners what we'll be talking about today?
So the topic that I've chosen is the Mitford sisters. I'll just say what like they're a group of sisters who were famous in kind of the 1920s until I guess just after the Second World War, but they do kind of come in and out of fame after that point as well.
Awesome. And what is it about the Mitford sisters that have ingrained themselves in historical scholarship and just common knowledge in the UK?
So they're quite famous in the UK because they were kind of like socialites at their time. and they had very opposing political views from each other. So
Mm.
one of the sisters, Diana, was a fascist. She was married to Oswald Mosley, who was the leader of the British Fascists Union, and the one of the other sisters, Unity Mitford, she was rumored to be in a relationship with Hitler. And then on the other side of that, there was Decca Mitford, who was a communist. She joined the Communist Party when she was in her like early teens. And then Nancy Mitford is famous because she was an author. She wrote about a kind of a reflection on her upper class family, and kind of how ridiculous everything was that was going on in her world, basically.
Fascinating. It's really interesting when you look at like these powerful families of the early 20th century and how they are connected to everybody. And you know, here in the state we have like, you know, the major families like, you know, the Rockefellers and the others who are like titans of like their industry. But this family in particular, the Mitford sisters, from what you've just explained to me, Rosie, is that they were like ingrained in like other political ideologies, which I would imagine, you know, it would be a very tense household with sisters believing in different political ideologies, associating themselves with vastly different people. So, what is it about the Mitford sisters that's so enticing to you as an historian? And what makes their whole upbringing so unique as opposed to the other socialites of the 20th century in the UK? Besides the obvious, as you mentioned before, one was married to Oswald Mosley, one was in a supposed relationship with Hitler, and the other was a member of the Communist Party.
Yeah, so I think for historians, they're really interesting because they're kind of like showing lots of different aspects of society in one family. Like they kind of are showing all the different opposing views of the time. They also kind of are seen as quite eccentric. So they were in the circles of kind of the bright young things of the 1920s. But I think because of the way Nancy Mitford was writing about her family, it's kind of made them seem like they were really had an eccentric upbringing and quite interesting for historians to look at. So, in one of her books, The Pursuit of Love, which is probably her most famous book, she has a character called Uncle Matthew in that, and it's basically based off her father. And in The Pursuit of Love, Uncle Matthew is like going and chasing the girls in the story with like a horse as like a joke, like hunting them. And then people actually think that the stuff in this book actually happened to the Mitford sisters, even though
Mm.
it's all very exaggerated. So they went down kind of for being eccentric as well as all their opposing views of each other. And a lot of their stories were ending up on the front pages of like the newspapers, and just kept them kind of in relevance, um, even though they're probably not doing anything any weirder than other socialites at the time. But I think because so much was written about them, and there's lots of collections of their letters, and things like that that have just kept them in the public eye. And I think, yeah, Nancy writing her books that reflected upon her upbringing has just kept them in that kind of view. Um, but yeah, there's like lots of different things that make them kind of interesting with all the sources that are available. And yeah, and obviously with Unity Mitford being rumored to be in a relationship with Hitler has kept her, the family, kind of in the public eye. And recently, there's been a release of like secret diaries of hers, so it's brought them kind of back into the mainstream media again.
Hmm, fascinating. So now I'm actually curious to talking about, you know, these three sisters because how many sisters were in the Mitford family?
So I think there's six of them. So there was Nancy, she's the oldest sister, then Diana, Unity, Decca, who was actually called Jessica, but she got called Decca, and then Deborah, and then there's a brother, so there's like 6 overall. The brother obviously doesn't get included with the sisters, but
Of course.
um, he was. Oh, there's also another sister, Pamela. She is very much forgotten because she didn't actually do anything really controversial in her time. Um, she was kind of. They basically called her um like woman because she liked cooking and cleaning and being like a housewife as opposed to like being a socialite and being
Hmm.
a author like the others.
Okay, fascinating. So I'm actually curious to dive deep into probably the three who are probably the most, you know, controversial out of this family. So let's actually start with the one who is married to Oswald Mosley. And for those who don't know who Oswald Mosley is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rosie, but from my understanding, Oswald Mosley was the leader of Britain's fascist party. And here in the States, as well as some documentaries that have been made about him, limited as they are, they viewed him as English, or should I say, Britain's equivalent or Britain's pseudo Hitler, in the sense that what Hitler was doing at the time in Nazi Germany, Oswald wanted to replicate it in the UK. So, how did this sister meet Oswald, and how did that sort of affect the family from that perspective?
Yeah, so yeah, as you said, Oswald Mosley, he actually started out as kind of a normal politician and then became more and more right wing and started the British Union of Fascists, which was, yeah, the equivalent to like the British equivalent to Hitler, essentially. Um, so Diana was actually married to Brian Guinness, who's part of the Guinness family. So she married when she was like 19 into this really uber rich family. And then she met Oswald Mosley at a party. He was actually already married as well. So they were both married when they first met. They started having an affair, and she decided to leave her husband for Oswald Mosley, even though he wasn't ever going to leave his wife. He had already categorically said he would never leave his wife because of like the controversy that that would cause. Even though he was known for having multiple affairs,
Mm,
he pretty much didn't agree with leaving his wife. But he was happy with Diana leaving her husband. Obviously, this caused a lot of problems for the family because they are very traditional. The parents didn't agree with her leaving her husband, so she was pretty much estranged from her parents. And it also meant that her younger siblings, because there was quite a big age gap, obviously there's 7 kids, they didn't have them all at once. So
mhm,
the younger siblings weren't allowed to go and visit her. They weren't allowed to like go and hang out with her because, that would corrupt their minds into, you know, fraternizing with a woman who is getting divorced. Um, and yeah, so in that regard, like it was really controversial for her to make that decision to leave her husband. Also, people like her sister Nancy didn't like Oswald Mosley. So one of the books that Nancy wrote, Wigs on the Green, is like a reflection on how bad fascism is. And essentially that kind of estranged Diana and Nancy from each other for quite a while because they didn't like the book that was written.
mhm,
Um, and yeah, just it caused a lot of problems between the family. Um, and later on, the decision for so as, at some point, um, Oswald Mosley's wife died, and then Diana and Oswald Mosley were able to get married. They were actually married in Berlin in Goebbels' drawing room with Hitler present. So again, quite controversial,
yes.
especially once the Second World War started. Obviously, they faced a lot of problems. Diana and Oswald Mosley were both locked up in prison separately. One, Diana was in Holloway Prison for women, and Oswald Mosley was in a prison for men. And Diana had a horrific time in prison and during the war because she was separated from her young children. I think one of her children was only like a couple of months old. So her decision to be with Oswald Mosley was not it wasn't a good one. It wasn't an easy one, and the whole family were essentially under scrutiny from her decision to marry him and be with him. And yeah, it causes like so Diana's mother, Sydney, she basically decided that she was a fascist and she liked the ideology of Hitler and
Hmm.
fascism. And then that essentially led to the breakup of the relationship between her and her husband. So essentially, Diana's marriage to Oswald Mosley's caused the split between her own parents because they agreed, like they disagreed so strongly on the issues. During the war, Nancy actually reported Diana to the police for her fascism, and that's why she did end up in prison. So it really like split the whole family up. Was really controversial.
My goodness, that is, that's a lot for like a family to go through. First, you have your one, and I imagine this is the one who married Oswald. She is the older sister of the children. Is she like the oldest one?
So Diana was the second oldest. So
Ah,
Nancy's the oldest, and then Diana was next, I think. Yeah,
okay.
or it
Eh,
was either Pamela or Diana, but yeah. So she was yeah one of the older
Definitely.
ones.
Okay. And like to have like one of your like oldest kids who's like a representation of your family being associated with pretty much a political criminal at the time, even before the war and even during the war, that's a lot of strain because now everyone's looking at you differently. They're going to say you are a collaborator, you're a co conspirator. Did you know? Like all of the shame that came from this. I mean, that would be too much. And then, of course, as you just mentioned right now, Rosie, the other sister leaving her husband due to her fascination and maybe some could argue obsession with Hitler put even more strain on the family. It's like this family cannot get a break. And I've always been very, very intrigued by these very powerful families in the States and in UK, even like around Europe during the early 20th century, like how close they are to these very powerful people and how interacting with them is like it's a coin toss. They could be hugely beneficial to the family's benefit, or it could be the downfall for the family. And in this case, it seems like this would be a plunge downward for the family. So now, how did the other sister, the one who joined communism, how did that, affect the family? Because I would imagine at the time communism would have been seen as the lesser of two evils as opposed to, fascism and Nazism, which was like the main and still the main threat to Europe and the world before, during, and after the war.
Yeah, so interestingly, communism was seen as just as bad as being fascist, if not worse, especially
Mm,
for the upper class. The upper class's worst fear was communism, Labour government, and anything to do with like helping the lesser in society. So at the time, because so this was all happening like slightly before the war, so before
okay.
people realized, well, obviously it comes into the war. Diana and Mosley still supported fascism right until the end of the war. But so this was in the kind of like the late 30s before people realized how much of a threat Hitler was before the
Mm,
war fully kicked off. So in their eyes, communism was 10 times worse in a way than Hitler at this point because he was just being seen as like a powerful leader. As only once it started kind of going onwards that people were like, actually, this is just as bad. So when Decca, she's the second youngest sibling, so basically it said that, so she shared a room with her sister Unity, who's the one who became a Nazi. It said that they both used to like have one side of the room decorated in like communist posters, the other side decorated in like fascist Nazi symbols, and like it was very opposing. But essentially, when she was 19, she went to a dinner at her, I think it was her auntie's house. And she met her cousin, who it was called Esmond Romilly. He's actually one of the nephews of Winston Churchill, and he was a communist. He was writing, so he got kicked out of school for like writing a communist magazine, and he was kind of on the run from school, writing all this communist stuff, and was like really actively involved. But at dinner they met, and she was very into communism. They met, fell in love. I mean, I don't know how easily they fell in love within like a couple of hours, but in that moment, on that night, they decided to run away together. They forged a plan, so she went back home. No one knew that she'd met Esmond because he'd been on the run, so no one actually knew that he was at this dinner. Went home, made a plan, basically lied to her parents that she was going on a holiday with her friends. Her parents went and bought her loads of clothes. Her dad gave her money. And essentially, instead of her actually going on this holiday, she ran away to Spain to join the communist forces who were fighting against the
Yes.
fascist uprising at the start of like the Spanish Civil War, I think it is. So she ran away with Esmond to Spain. The problem was you couldn't get a visa directly to Spain, so they went to France first, because France is where people were getting boats over to Bilbao. And essentially, at some point, her parents wrote a letter to her friend's house saying, "Oh, are you there now? Like, have you made it to the location you were meant to be going to on this holiday?" Obviously got a letter back saying she's not here. There's no holiday. Like, what are you on about?
Mm.
And this caused a massive manhunt, and lots of press attention, because obviously they didn't know where she had gone. Eventually, it was worked out that she had met Esmond Romilly and they ran away together. And all the front pages of the newspapers were things like Duke's daughter runs away to fight in war and stuff like this. And eventually, because Winston Churchill he was the uncle of Esmond, but he was also related to her. I think they were like cousins. Esmond and
Ooh.
Decca were cousins, or not cousins, but like related. So essentially, Decca's mum went in to call in a favor from Churchill because he was foreign secretary. Um, and they essentially said that if she didn't agree to come home, they would stop the aid boats going into Spain. And like, so she would essentially cause the death of like a load of Spanish people. So they decided to stay in France, but she didn't decide to go home. And her sister Nancy went out there with her husband to try and convince them to come back, but they wouldn't come back. And it was just a massive like media story at the time. And they actually named the wrong sister in the Daily Mail. They named her
Ooh.
younger sister. So her younger sister sued the Daily Mail to get money back, because obviously that was really damaging for her to be said that she'd run away with like a man, and like unmarried. And yeah, eventually Esmond and Decca got married, and uh, yeah, they decided to like fully commit to the communist cause. So Decca never saw her father again. The last time she saw him was when she was getting on the train to this holiday where she ran away. And she did see her mother again because her mother decided to kind of brush under the carpet so she could actually see her daughter, but her father never forgave her. And for the rest of her life, that she ended up moving to America, and was part of communist groups throughout her life. which did get her into some trouble because in America, communism, even after the war, was really frowned upon, and could get you in a lot of trouble if you joined communist groups. So she had a good life, but she did like face the law a few times in terms of like her communist um things that she was doing.
Absolutely. And, it is very interesting when you look at, Britain's relationship with, communism. There's a lot of movies and a lot of documentaries that specifically talk about that, which I find, absolutely fascinating how we have so many documentaries on, people who were agents of the Communist Party, who worked in government, or who were spies for the Communist Party, doing covert missions in the inner circles of the British elite. It is very, very fascinating. And you're absolutely right. In the States, we also had the rise of the American Communist Party, which is more like the grassroots areas of the country, more so in the South, particularly where you had farmers, white farmers, and black sharecroppers who were advocating for the communist mantra, uh, who wanted, equal rights, civil liberties. And it is very fascinating how, at the time, you know, in a way, one could argue that the Communist Party, or what the ideals of communism at the time in the 30s, was a precursor to, the civil rights movement here in the States. But that could be a discussion in of itself for another episode. So looking back now in this family, so you have one daughter that ran away, who possibly now shamed the family more so than the other sisters. One who's married to Oswald Mosley, who's in prison. You have another daughter who's written letters to Hitler. It's just so, like, how much can one family take? I mean, the scandal, like seeing their names in the newspaper and everything, it will be too much. So let's actually talk about now the other sister who has sort of been like writing about this and documenting this. So how does she, I know you've mentioned this earlier, Rosie, but how did she view all that was happening to her family? Was there sort of like, almost like in Game of Thrones, like like the shame walk, like shame because of her last name being Mitford, and her sisters who are made in the news? It may be like a bad taste in someone's mouth.
So, although she definitely didn't agree with her sisters, I think in a way she was never ashamed of being a Mitford. I
Mm.
think she was because she was the oldest sister, she was
Mm.
the one who originally kind of almost got the Mitfords on the map by being a socialite, by being
Oh.
um, she was like at all the parties, and that's kind of, so in a way she almost made their name in the first place. And I think actually for her, for writing and selling her books, probably having her name on there, with no shame for herself of being who she was, then I think it worked out for her. And obviously, it was well known that she didn't agree with her sister's views. Um, and as I said, like I think it came out after the war that she'd like reported her sister to the police. She'd like given intelligence over to like the Secret Service to make sure that her like sister and brother-in-law weren't just out and about, like doing things. And yeah, there was moments where she was estranged from the family for writing bad things about them. So I think it worked for her because she was writing about her experience, which she didn't have the view of like fascism or communism.
Mhm.
She was quite neutral. So she was very much writing about how ridiculous it was all to her. And I think people enjoyed that. They enjoyed seeing like how ridiculous she talks about how ridiculous the middle, like the upper class are in most of her books. Um, the kind of themes and stuff are like, oh, upper class have to do something this way, but then the book's reflecting like, why do they have to do that? That's so stupid.
Mm.
And like in The Pursuit of Love, which is like her most famous book, which I guess she had written books before this, but this was like the big one. It very much like just ridicules like people in the upper class, ridicules like fascism, ridicules communism, kind of just like reflecting on why were people like, what were people doing, why were they like this, um and just a different reflection, like people were really interested in it because it was almost laughable, the things she's talking about, but it's actually how people were thinking.
Fascinating. So pretty much she is, she's pretty much commentating on, the social elite. She's saying like, all the ridiculousness that the social elite has to go through, while at the same time she's writing about, the idiocracies of fascism, Nazism, and communism, and how they get people to join them. And, I would imagine later in life, she's probably written, biographies or maybe done interviews about, what it did for her family. But I'm also very curious of looking at the other perspective in a sense, like how outsiders, people outside the family, have been writing about the Mitford sisters. So, Rosie, in your own personal research, have you ever come across books that have, documented the Mitford sisters? And through your research, what is sort of like the common theme that is overarching in these scholarships?
Yes, there's quite a few biographies and books written about them by lots of different people. So, um, some of the books are like the analysis of like letters from them, which has been like edited by family members. Some of it's just by kind of people who have managed to speak to the family um, personally, because so for example, Diana only died in like 2000s. Decca, the youngest one, I think died fairly recently, so people have been able to speak to the members of the family
Mm,
and write about them. I think like the sense that most of like the scholars and like books that I've read is that they weren't like an evil family, that they were just, you know, interesting. They had an interesting upbringing, they had an interesting kind of way of dealing with life. And even with someone like Diana, who did marry into, she married Oswald Mosley, like it's almost like she isn't like a bad person. They've just gone down a different path. Like
mm,
they've kind of analyzed how easily it is for people to be influenced by certain viewpoints. And, you know, because when they first became fascist, they were never to know that Hitler would do what he would do. So I guess it's like you think of an ideology and then obviously something would happen that would then make you not believe in the ideology. And they did turn away from fascism after, obviously, after the Second World War. They turned away from fascism, at least publicly, they turned away from fascism. There's not really any evidence that they continued with their fascist
mm,
things after that. And even with kind of Unity, who is the one who had a supposed relationship with Hitler, like a lot of things have been written about her that are, you know, completely have no evidence to back up what was going on. So like there's a rumor that she was pregnant with like Hitler's child. There's no evidence for that. There's also no evidence that they were ever in a relationship. It's just based off people saying, yeah, that's what happened. But actually, from a lot of evidence that historians have looked at, it's quite unlikely that she was in a relationship with Hitler. And she was more likely to have just been in relationships, casual relationships with some SS officers and stuff like that.
mm.
Obviously not great, but
No.
not quite as dramatic as some of the things that have been said about her. Because basically, when World War II was declared, like when Britain declared war on Germany, she shot herself, but she survived. And people said that actually no, she didn't shoot herself, like she was pregnant and that's why she had to be rushed back to like the UK for medical help. But actually there's more evidence for the fact that she shot herself and that she wasn't currently pregnant at this point,
Mm.
or anything like that. But I think people like to kind of over exaggerate the stories. I mean, I personally haven't read the new Secret Diaries that have come out from Unity, so maybe that might change the story again of what she was up to in Germany and what like her involvement in what was going on. But essentially I think she was just a very young girl who was easily swayed by something that she thought was interesting. I don't think she was like, I don't know, like there's no evidence that she was getting involved in like things. It was more that she was like, oh, this is like a hobby, this is like a passion, like almost quite naive
Okay.
um outlook on the world essentially. But yeah, I think it's like quite interesting. But I think most people reflect on the fact that they lived through certain time periods where a lot of things were going on, and that their upbringing and things like that all kind of merged together to make them the family that they were, and that actually by analyzing see lots of different aspects of British society through them as a family.
Absolutely. And I actually like how you brought up the fact that that in a lot of scholarship that, scholars and historians don't view this family as like evil or, wicked. Yes, they were controversial in the sense that their daughters, you know, allied or were at least fascinated or maybe been a part of these groups that were, you know, they didn't know any better at the time that would evolve into, very heinous ideologies, but they didn't know at the time. And it's very interesting, how, again, perception of these characters could change depending on like who's writing the source material. And I'll use an example of, Peaky Blinders. And for those who know the show, Peaky Blinders is set during like after World War One and follows, of course, the gang of the Peaky Blinders. But the reason I'm bringing this up is when we are introduced to the character of Oswald Mosley, and also the character, which I forgot. I don't know if it's the same actress of Anna Taylor Joy. Maybe she may be someone else. But there is a character which I now know thanks to Rosie is definitely one of the Mitford sisters. But it's very interesting in how the people portray that sister, the particular sister, as sort of like this seductress, kind of wicked person. Not evil, but she's not necessarily good. So it is, interesting how nowadays people who create shows or write stories from the past want to tell a particular narrative. Whereas Rosie has just mentioned that in history, you know, this sister was not necessarily evil or wicked. She was just, very fascinated with the ideology. Yet in the show, she's portrayed as an entirely different character, which I imagine for the family who may have seen that would have been like, well, that's not my sister. That's not who she was. Yes, she was this aspect, but she wasn't entirely this evil person. So it is very fascinating how, characters like these in history can often be taken and put in a narrative which may or may not be, truly accurate, regardless of, their affiliations and associations. So I guess also going forward, Rosie, what do you think we can learn from the Mitford sisters historically in terms of like their outlook as almost like a point of like how to explore, these different ideologies? And do you think that same mindset can also be applied to other powerful families in the UK who may have been involved in other uh, political circles?
Yeah, I think historically, I mean, obviously we can learn a lot about the time period. We can learn a lot about the upper class at the time, like this was all happening, because a lot of the things they were doing kind of almost reflected some of the things like other people were up to. Um, I think it's quite hard to say whether, say, if there's other similar families, whether you could spot patterns and stuff like that
Mm.
potentially you might be able to see similarities. I'm not sure if it would be able to be used to like, see a family that are currently controversial in the news and like compare them. Potentially there is some
Hmm.
similarities, but I think they definitely can tell us a lot about that time period, and also just, different ideologies and how people can easily be influenced into thinking certain ways, I guess.
Absolutely. And I believe that is, very true. I mean, every outlook can be used as a lens for history. Families are no exception. I mean, there are many powerful families, not even just powerful families, but just families in general who we could view to see, what the world was like and see, history through their eyes. Granted, it's going to be from their perspective. So you would have to fill in the gaps of like, what was the world like, but definitely for like these socialite families, the Mitford families, it's really intriguing to know what the world was like and how they viewed these very powerful figures as well as these ideologies that were emerging. And I think as a final question, Rosie, and this actually more is to you, is there any other controversial family in British history that you think deserves some scholarship? And this could be any family from the 20th century, 19th, 18th, or even the pre modern era in British history.
Off the top of my head, I'm trying to think. There's so many different ones. I'm sure there are definitely some from maybe earlier time periods. I can't think of any specific names, but yeah, I guess with like the Mitfords, we've got so much documentation on them that we know exactly like what they were up to. I guess if you go back further, then potentially there might be less written about them and less like letters and stuff that have been saved. So I guess if there was someone, like if there was another family, then I guess it would be about trying to find that info about them. But yeah, if I find anyone, then I'll come back on the podcast and tell you about them.
Absolutely. And I think for me to add a comment to this before we officially end, the one family I would love to look more into is a little bit, maybe in a way tied to my own, is of course Simon de Montfort. Now, for those who don't know who Simon de Montfort is, Simon de Montfort was an English knight, or rather, a French knight who came to England because his father, Simon de Montfort, the fifth Earl of Light, the fifth Earl in his family, he was killed, and Simon de Montfort was raised by the Queen of France and raised alongside her son, the Sun King of France, Louis. And he was sent to England to earn lands, earn title, and he was, of course, the brother-in-law to Henry III. And there's a lot of controversy, around him in particular of his relationship with possibly Henry's wife, his sister, who is Simon's wife when they get officially married, him being in exile, sent to Brittany, him going to the Holy Lands, people wanting him to be, the new king, a rightful king of England, even though he had no technical blood ties to the family, despite being married into. There was a lot of controversy saying that his son, or rather Henry's son, Longshanks, was possibly Simon's child with the Queen of England. There's no official record of that, but that was a huge story at the time. And why Simon de Montfort is such a very interesting character in English history is that he led the Barons' Revolt, if I'm not mistaken, the second Barons' Revolt against Henry III to establish a parliament-style government in the um, the United Kingdom, which not a lot of people know about that. Like why Simon de Montfort was huge. If he had been successful in establishing a parliament-style government in the 1200s, that would have drastically changed the political landscape of English history. Would it have survived like into the 1300s, 1500s, maybe even the Georgian era, it's very hard to say. Would we have even had an English Civil War if a parliament system was already in place? We don't know, but it's this family that I'm very into. And the reason why I bring this up to me is that my family, at least on my mother's side, has the name Montfort. So we've always had this very fascinating that possibly we're related to this family, but there's no truth to it. But that's what's very interesting about these very powerful families is that through them we can see history through their eyes and really try to understand, where they fit in the political history and just history in general of the time they were in. And as we said before in this episode, anything and anyone can be used as a tool of reference in the study of history. And powerful families, royal, socialite, political, they are no exception and should be treated with the respect they deserve. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude this amazing episode for the month of February. I am so excited to have Rosie come back on the show. We are so excited to have her back, and hopefully, we can have her back for a third episode, maybe a special. Who knows? So, Rosie, thank you again for coming back on the show. I really do appreciate it. But before we officially end, where can people find you on social media? As well as, do you have any announcements for any projects that you are a part of this year that our viewers could be, expecting sometime soon? Any magazines coming out?
Yeah, so on socials, I do have my own socials, History with Rosie, but I don't really post there that much at the moment. But mostly you can find me on the Historians magazine. And yeah, so we've got five more, well, we've got six magazines coming out this year just for the Historians magazine, and then we've got five Little Historians magazines editions coming out. The next Little Historians one is about the Georgians, so exploring that era of history. And we filmed a lot of videos for that one. And yeah, we're also doing some workshops in Bath for the Little Historians magazine in April. And yeah, pretty much everything that we're doing will be on our social pages or our website. So if you want to check out anything on there, then it will definitely be on there at some point if we're doing anything cool.
Awesome. I'll link all that down below in the description of this video, as well as linking if I remember the right URL, the link to join the Historians magazines to be a contributing writer. I urge this for any historian who wants to get into these prospect of writing history. It's a great experience, a great launching pad. I myself have written for the Historians magazine numerous times. In fact, you can't see it, viewers and listeners, but I have mounted on my wall the first magazine I was officially published in, which is, of course, the history of sports. And my contributing piece was the origins of the gladiators, which I absolutely love. I love the Historians magazine because it was the first magazine that I truly wrote for to really show that I can write about history as well as showcase my writing. And I have grown since then. So I urge all of my followers, whether you are students of history, you have a passion for writing, or you're a history enthusiasts and want to do something incredibly fun and contributing, definitely check out the Historians magazine. And also make sure to buy a copy of the Historians magazine because you will not be disappointed. There are so many amazing topics in these issues. You will not be disappointed. You will always learn something new. So I will link all that down below in the description of this video, as well as tagging Rosie's first episode right here. So make sure to give that a watch as well. And as always, viewers and listeners, thank you for joining us for an incredible episode in the Historians Lounge series. Again, a huge thank you to Rosie for coming on the show. We love having her and wish her the very best going forward into 2025 for her and her team of the Historians magazine and Little Historians. And as always, viewers and listeners, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. What was your favorite part of the episode? And is there a famous family that you would like to learn about who had ties to history in some way? Comment down below. And as always, I will see you all in the next episode. So until then, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world, have a wonderful day.